Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Lora Cecere. I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and we're trying something a little different. I have Alex Wisniewski, who is going to be interviewing me in blog posts and the countdown for the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit. So the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit is held every year. It's our 10th year of holding this event. It's a small meeting and it's really designed for extreme networking. And Alex helped me with the event last year, and he's agreed to help me with really getting some of the podcasts done. So Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Laura. Really great to be here. So excited to be joining you for the 10th summit this year.
Yeah, so tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name's Alex. I work with a company called the Digital PMO Group, and we assist our clients with agile program and project management solutions that really focus on digital transformation projects across an organization's supply chain. I previously helped Fortune 500 companies and their law departments create information management and data governance programs and strategies with a focus on privacy and records management. So a little bit newer to the space, specific to supply chain, but was always in the data heavy aspect and kind of what we'll call the background or the technology transformation side of things. When I got the chance to join Digital PMO Group as a kind of a project manager, the expertise that I saw across the digital landscape and kind of applied to the supply chain was a new challenge I was really excited to tackle. So really happy to be here. And then Laura, obviously I followed your work for some time and connected with you on the side once I started joining the industry, and after reading your blog and coming across quite a bit of your content, whether that was online or in the book form. Was so excited once we got to work together last year. I was able to handle kind of the social media side for the conference.
So tell the group a little bit about the conference and your conference experience. What can they expect?
Sure. The Supply Chain Insights Global Summit is a fantastic conference that really puts you in the mindset, not so much to think about your problems as they are today and really the quick fixes and the band-aids that you're hoping to put on the problems, but really get you thinking about your vision 5-10 years from now. Laura uses the phrase, imagine 2030, imagine supply chain 2030, and that really helps people get in the mindset of the challenges that they're trying to solve, which then also brings them around like-minded people that are trying to solve those challenges. So not only are you getting the content to solve those problems, but you're meeting people and able to really kind of level set and work with each other to raise the floor and bring everyone up as an industry, which is really exciting and a great place to do it.
Get into the dialogue around the blog posts. So this week I did 2 blog posts, and let's talk. What did you get out of the blog post? What are your questions?
Yeah, great. Let's start with the one you published today. I thought it was really interesting, the risk of venture capital takeover of supply chain software providers. Anaplan, a new victim. Obviously, I was just reading your LinkedIn post, Laura, and I saw some people in the comments basically saying, this is why we like it. We enjoy the talk straight. You know what I mean? It's straight talk, no chaser. It's all of the stuff that you very much intend. And I was hoping to kind of ask you your thoughts around, really there's three key steps you outlined. Anaplan or not Anaplan, we'll just consider this software providers when venture capital joins, right? So you outlined 3 steps if a software provider your company's using has an interjection of venture capital. The first one is if you're consider using it or consider purchasing it, explore other options before you do. Second one is if you're using it, consider alternatives. And then third one is if you're using the technology and switching is, kind of too costly. You talk about building resources and ensuring business continuity regardless of that tool and reducing dependency on that tool. And I was hoping we could spend a little bit of time on this third point and how you've seen organizations successfully supplement software providers if this happens. Because I'm just realizing organizations can't flip a switch on and off. It takes some time. They have to get buy-in. They have to find budgets. They have to evaluate new tools. So I thought this point in particular would add some value to your listeners.
Okay, well, let's take it point by point. Let's simplify the questions a little bit, and then let's have a dialogue about it. So let's simplify the first question. Where would you like to start?
First question, how have you seen organizations successfully supplement a software provider that has recently received an interjection of capital? Whether that's on the project front or a new tool front, how have you seen that?
In three different ways. I've seen them hire the consultants from that company. So typically when a company gets an interjection of capital, very senior talent, whether it's consulting or developers, because they've been there a long time, will get a pretty nice buyout and they'll want to leave. And the best way to protect your investment is just scoop up those consultants that implemented it, that know the software, that have the contacts within the company that you are using the software of. The second is look for someone in the industry, particularly in cloud-based software, that can offer alternate support. Somebody who has a deep bench in the software and maybe offers premium services for the maintenance of that software or working on debugging. Typically, it could be a system integrator that just happens to have more of a platinum relationship with that software company and is more in the day-to-day contact with them because they've got multiple projects on the go, whereas the manufacturer may have less frequency of need to interface with a software company. And then the third is to deal with it like legacy, just work with it until it breaks and replace it, not invest in it and just to say, we're going to just kind of run this sort of like an old car until the wheels fall off and then replace it. So I've seen those three strategies work.
Fantastic. Definitely have seen that specifically, that second point that you mentioned, kind of that parallel support around the system integrator side work on one of my clients that actually used Anaplan specifically, which is really interesting. So very, very timely response. I'll say that from my point of view. So Laura, I think there's, one point of view. I was just trying to look at this from both sides of the coin, and obviously, a lot of your audience is supply chain professionals, but there's also, I realize, probably a fair amount of VCs that may look at your content or read your content if they're trying to understand or invest prior to investing. So if you were to flip the script, Laura, what advice would you give to a venture capitalist to best support a thriving company and not squash it?
Well, the first advice I'd give is understand the market. Most venture capitalists have groups of people that believe they understand the market, but they really don't. So pretty high ego, and they want to have heavy touch. I say hang your egos at the door and get to know your customers and get to know your customers' pain. Go visit your customers, listen to their pain, talk not only to the business users, but also to the executives and understand who you serve, and then rationalize the needs of who you serve with your investment strategy for your financial investors. What most financial capitalists do is they look at the needs of their financial investors of, I'm going to make these incremental gains quickly without really understanding how the business users are using the software and what drives long-term value. Most of the companies, their financial investors are not really after long-term value, and so there's a disconnect right there. They're typically looking to turn their money in 2 years, whereas a business leader is usually looking for a business relationship of 3 to 5 years or 5 to 10 years. So that's a disconnect. And then I think be honest with the companies that are using the software about what you're doing, so that they can plan with you. But I think right now there's a lot of words used that aren't really aligned with the divergent priorities and intent.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, right? You mentioned when they come in, some of the first things they do, they change the structure. They change the structure after the buyout. They keep the staff, or excuse me, they decrease the staff size. Have you seen any maybe successful injections of capital, and have they done any of these things, or is it typically all negative? I'm just curious.
I have seen some investments of capital that have worked out okay. Like I've seen some Francisco partner investments that have been more purposeful. I work with a firm in Baltimore that tends to be more purposeful. Thoma Bravo is, I think, one of the worst of the lot. Insights Ventures is kind of at the top of my list also of, short-term gains. So they're not all cut from the same cloth, so to speak. So
Sure.
Understand them and what drives them.
So kind of diving back into the organizations that use Anaplan, obviously that was, it might be a sore subject. Some of those folks might not want to read this article. This also might be the ammunition some folks need, Lora, to finally make that change away from Anaplan, understand some of the pain points, especially given the case that you just laid out here. What things would you recommend one of your readers or listeners here do should they decide to move away or consider an alternative before they start those conversations?
Well, the first thing is to understand that there may be a risk, and for the business leaders to engage with the financial investors, to ask them kind of questions like I was advocating. And then the second thing is to look at how important is that software in the portfolio and really do that risk assessment of how big of a risk is it and what would they do against the alternatives. And we had outlined the alternatives at the beginning of the call.
And then last question I had on this article, Lora, and I want to make sure we're about halfway through our time, so I want to touch upon the other one. First key step you outlined, if you're using Anaplan here, is explore other options prior. Do you have any recommendations, and you want to throw off the top? I know you mentioned a few in the blog, but just wanted to also give you the chance to kind of audibly say them.
Well, I think that you've got to understand what do the software providers do. So Anaplan has a great user interface based upon connecting data, but it does not have depth of modeling or depth of policy and rule automation, things like ATP and allocation. But if a company has a lot of systems that they need an overlay for visibility, then I think Anaplan is a pretty good alternative. It's very much an enterprise class system. It's cloud-based, but you've got to be clear on what it is that you're trying to do. Whereas, somebody like OMP has much different, strengths in terms of modeling and, strength of financial positioning.
Great advice. Understand your needs before you just dive into a tool to solve them. Very, very, very wise.
And that sounds silly, Alex, because many people might be going, duh, but I've seen so many pieces of software bought off of PowerPoint where people don't know how to ask the right questions.
Yeah, write down your requirements for that software before engaging with them so you can get your clean thoughts on paper, right? Understand what your organization really needs, your pain points before people start almost planting thoughts in your head.
And it's not only, software feature ABC, but culturally, who do you want to partner with? What are the characteristics? How are upgrades made? Do they have conferences? Do they have user groups? What is their debt ratio? How are they investing? What is the future software going to look like? Most people start the conversations really looking at.
Fantastic advice. That is for sure. Lora, we have about 10 more minutes left in our conversation. Is it all right if we move on to the other one? Is there any other last thoughts on the perfect? All right. So on the next article, where variability is our only constant, which is fitting, right? Because in one of your opening paragraphs, you have a sentence: COVID, inflation, climate change, the war in Ukraine. Where do we start? And I felt that was just fitting to put in here. That's all I'll say. But my first question, really, it ties all those together. And you mentioned that the supply chain is a complex, non-linear system with many constraints. And when you're doing this very broad industry analysis as a supply chain professional, what constraints do you specifically watch out for?
Well, the traditional solutions were all about manufacturing constraints, but now we have logistics constraints, procurement constraints, we have labor constraints, and we need to be able to look at all of the constraints across source, make, and deliver, and to be able to make the best choices on constraints and flows.
Yeah, definitely across the entire value chain, not just the supply chain in that sense. Kind of on a similar note, Lora, when you mentioned kind of specific to the inflation component of the article, what supply chain variables do you analyze when evaluating the impact of inflation? You mentioned oil and gas prices, kind of crude derivatives. What else do you, it's kind of in the same line, variables, constraints, what do you analyze when it comes to specifically inflation as that starts to ramp up in the United States?
Well, we look at the cost of capital, we look at energy costs, and we look at major commodities, and those vary by industry, whether it's cotton for apparel or plastics for packaging or protects the cost of lumber for building. Each industry has a primary commodity that's driving it. So fuel, energy, cost of capital, the primary sourcing ingredient, cost of labor when we're looking at, overall inflationary pressures.
Do you think most organizations have a good grasp around what that primary commodity is if they have a well-developed supply chain?
Typically, they know the commodity, but they don't have a good system for what I call bidirectional orchestration, which is looking at the changing costs of that commodity and the impact on the supply chain, whether it's alternate bill of material, postponement, alternate sourcing, maybe it's changing product portfolio. Only 29% of companies can see total cost, and most companies don't have a good way to make those trade-offs. At least not at the speed of market. They might have gone like, oops, we should have made a different decision 30 days ago, but they don't have the systems to really know what the right answer is in the moment of when they're making the decision.
Interesting. And does that kind of tie into those third order effects that you were mentioning and creating visibilities around those risks as well?
Not really. So Alex, the article is, really think hard about your supply chain, because the press talks about first order effects like the cost of oil, but they don't talk about the impact of oil substrates or hydrocarbon substrates on over 6,000 products. And we'll talk about the cost of palladium and the impact on the automotive industry with catalytic converters. But we're not talking about that's going to drive up theft of the catalytic converters, and we're going to need guards for catalytic converters, and we're going to need to really make the supply chain much more robust for the aftermarket, because we're not able to get as many cars because of the lack of palladium, the lack of titanium, the cost of nickel, the semiconductor shortage. Cars are going to become much more expensive, and lead times are going to become longer, which is going to push us more into the aftermarket and more into services and perhaps theft or, demanufacturing of cars. So what does that mean for business models? What does that mean for business opportunities? So, for example, a business opportunity is to put a guard on a catalytic converter to prevent people from stealing them in the inner cities, right? And so that's what I mean by second and third order effects. Let's just don't talk about what's short. Let's talk about how that product affects the multiple nodes of the supply chain, the alternatives, and what the risks are and what the opportunities are.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. So that, and if I hear you correctly, that bidirectional orchestration and having the insight around that for your primary commodity is different in the sense that that's really what we'll call first order still.
So for example, I used to make ice cream, and there were 22 different formulations for vanilla ice cream. And depending upon what was happening on dairy fat, which is the most expensive component of ice cream, I would change the formulation, and I would follow the consumption of yogurt as a leading indicator, because when there was more consumption of yogurt, then I had more opportunity to buy butterfat at a lower price. So when I scheduled my vanilla ice cream, I tried to take advantage of what was happening in the butterfat market based upon all of the companies that were pulling from the multiple streams of the dairies.
Interesting.
So thinking about the first, second, and third order effects, substitution and alternatives, and how you do that, bidirectional orchestration across source, make, and deliver is where I think people need to really have their heads.
Got it. So you kind of just mentioned a few of them there. Maybe can you highlight them in a little bit more detail? How do you supply chain professionals map those second, third order effects? Is it through substitutions? Is it through understanding the different interconnected variables of your product? How do supply chain professionals go about that web in diving into it?
Well, the first thing you've got to do is say, what is happening? And then what will that impact, and how will that change the alternates? So either the competition or the substitution or the use, and how will that change the relative industries, those that we serve, those that, we supply, and how can I drive bidirectional orchestration strategies to be able to get the upper hand?
Lora, as we wrap up here, I wanted to ask you about kind of using these variables. And when we think of these variables, a lot of them are what you call outside variables and how they affect your inward processes. Can you speak to a little bit about the work you're doing with Project Zebra, if people don't know, but then also how you see organizations really being able to use this as an opportunity, not so much think about the past or change the ways of the past, but use this as a way to look forward. Because as you say, when variabilities are only constant, what else can we do?
Zebra is a way that we are defining, mapping, and testing outside-in processes, because today's processes are inside out. They're assuming that the order represents demand and that the primary driver of optimization engines is transactional data from ERP. In an outside-in process, you assume that the order does not represent demand. You understand demand latency, or the time that it takes from channel consumption to an order, and you understand the bullwhip effects by measuring distortion. And you're looking at coefficient of variation, or how easy is it to forecast, and forecast value add, how much am I improving the forecast? And you're looking at multiple inputs to multiple outputs. So in an outside-in demand model, you're typically modeling 20 to 30 different factors that will change over time. Whereas in an inside-out model, you'll typically be modeling orders or shipments. And so an outside-in model, for example, I work with a lot of agricultural companies. They'll measure how many hectares are planted by crop type. They'll measure what the government subsidies are for the crop type. They'll look at commodity prices for the crop type. They'll look at pestilence, whether it's weather-driven or perhaps insect-driven. They'll look at, moisture levels and weather. They'll look at, what's inventory of past harvest. And so all of these inputs go into the model, and then over time, the relative importance of these inputs changes because the market's changing. And you're dealing with the market signals and more current, so there's less latency. Does that help, Alex?
It does. And what it gives me some optimism for is some collaboration between business IT teams, data science teams to work together to build these planning solutions that work, that incorporate them all. They might not be perfect, Laura, but I do see a light on the horizon.
Well, I hope so. It's only if we can talk the same language and understand what a good plan is. So Alex, until next time, we had a good conversation. This is Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. We'll talk to you later.